think that clearly what we have learned over the past many months now with the stories that have been making headlines from a journalist's perspective is that there's a lot of work to be done in every city in America. And if there is some sense that, you know, there are cities where all is good and kumbaya, I think 2014 really showed us that that is not the case. And it makes sense. I think that one of the reasons we wanted to take this conversation across the country is that Americans, I believe, are very uncomfortable talking about race. Americans really don't want to talk about a really icky history, which includes lynchings. There's a new report out today. I think it was done by, was it in the New York Times? That looked at, they've now calculated more than 4,000 cases of lynching. And with photographs, you know, people used to go with their cameras and shoot pictures of lynching to sell the photographs to people. And these aren't lynchings that the public condemned. These are lynchings where 10 to 15,000 people came out to celebrate. It was like a party. You brought your children.
It was entertainment. One of the things that people forget is that women were also lynched. Jewish people were lynched. Labor organizers were lynched. But the preponderance of people who were lynched were, of course, African-American men.
It's something that makes people very uncomfortable, and I think conversations about race in general, we talk about these really uncomfortable moments in American history. I think you sort of have to tackle them. And I think every time, we've certainly seen in 2014 where you had a number of shootings that seemed to a large portion of the population to be unjustified, brought out a lot of protests. I think people need to figure out where this conversation about race and policing is going. And that's really why we wanted to start this conversation, which is something we've been discussing in our Black in America series since 2008.
When you ask about race relations in the Midwest, well, I don't want to target the Midwest as worse than anybody else or any place else. I do think that when you look at the coasts, New York, DC, San Francisco, LA, you're probably likely to find a bit more tolerance, although we do have the Eric Garner case.
And you have stop and frisk. I mean, if you look at the data from stop and frisk, that data would absolutely undermine it. I think New Yorkers like to feel like they're sort of, you know, here in New York, we don't. But if you look at the data, which is what we focused on our documentary in Stop and Frisk, 5 million people arrested, 85% of them roughly Black and Latino men, 90% were not brought in for any crime. There's a whole bunch of people who were stopped for no reason at all. And of course,
they have a nice day racism in New York, DC. San Francisco, I'm from San Francisco, particularly has to have a nice day racism. I mean, no one's going to call you the N-word to your face. They just, you know, you're not getting this job. Have a nice day. You know, I think the Midwest, and you all can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think is probably a little behind the issues of racial tolerance in other places. At least even the perception itself may be a little behind. Which is not a bad thing because the entire United States is not getting an A. No city is getting an A in race relations.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see that Black America and middle of Indiana, and I think what's troubling is that the projections of what's happening in media centers such as LA and New York, they give off a perception and impression that sometimes slows down the governments and administrations into their own, it puts them right back into their whole racial niche categories of trying to keep it the same old way versus what they're getting from the coastline media. And that's why this is an interesting series, and I'm honored to be a part of it. But I don't think people on the coastline or media centers have a clue on the middle. I think the clue that people have in the middle of the country, I don't even call it Midwest, it's central part of the United States from Utah, Pennsylvania. I think they get all their impressions when it comes to this television, to radio, media, and now increasingly to the web. And so they don't deal with the realities of Black across America face to face as much as they get in screens. And this has a large impact on city governments, county governments, judges, police forces, administrations, where the racial makeups happen to be like really disproportionate. It's interesting, you know, the impressions of race
lot of what we're going to talk about today is impressions. I mean, I think a lot of the challenges that we have in America right now is people come to these interactions with a very clear impression about what they should expect. And so sometimes that ends up in a death. Sometimes that ends up in misjudging people. I mean, there were 2 stories that I read today about officers being called to check on someone, a welfare check, in which the person was killed at the end of the welfare check. 2 today. and so we're at a time, I think, where what we perceive about other people is completely coloring our reactions to those people. Well, whether you're talking about law enforcement, or you're talking about hiring, or anything. I mean, obviously, this is your area of expertise.
Actually, I was going to jump in there because when we think about our local situation, we actually just had a big discussion about people from Chicago and how that's impacting our local area. And that's very much connected with perceptions people have about people from Chicago, the big city, and this association with crime in Chicago.
Yeah.
One of the other things is the way that President Obama is treated, which lets you know how little progress has been made. At the National Prayer Breakfast, he made a point to say that when part of our history, when we talk about people doing things in the name of the Lord, in the name of God, and the splashback that he gives every time he mentions race suggests again both the discomfort and a sense of perception. So that people in politics, people who are making the commentary, who are making these kind of comments about the president, wouldn't do that to a Bush. Of course, Bush wasn't smart enough to, never mind.
But I think there is an argument that we say, and I think you're very right. I do think the president, whenever he talks about race, people on all sides jump on him. But I think like that comment about Bush is a simple. There is a joke that's constantly made about President Bush and his intelligence. Well, and then it's a joke, and so I think
I'm not sure that I'm joking.
well, a half joke, a non-joke, and I think that is, you know, when people sort of give their defense, they say, well, everybody did the same thing to President Bush. It wasn't about race; he's a white man, but they did it on intelligence, or they did it on, you know, painting and paints other leaders. So, you know, I mean, I guess I think that there is a certain amount of disrespect that has started to, I think, devolve the office of the presidency.
But he wasn't, I mean, President Obama was born black. Nothing he could do about it. And so therefore, the splashback on him because he's a black man is very different than the splashback a Bush made about it. You're absolutely right. He was treated as if he was not the brightest bulb out there. But he said this, as far as I'm concerned, that illustrated at least his tendency toward mediocrity. He talked about how his grades were at Yale. And he said that everybody didn't have to have a decent average, that he had a C average. He says that. When you're attempting to motivate young people to go to college, to excel, to do well. I found that as a former college president, as someone who's been a professor, absolutely repugnant. I would tell students, do your best, get the best grades you can. You can get an average if you put your mind to it. Don't worry about how poorly you did in the last class. Focus on what you're going to do in the next class. Make that, you know, life experience. And so when the President of the United States says a gentleman's C is okay, you got to average.
I would also add the fact that at the last election, we go on the popular vote percentage, I think Romney was 48%, or what was it, 47%, or whatever.
That was a poor people.
Oh,
that was a number that were dependent on the government. That was for 47%.
Well, whatever the losing percentage was, I think for the first time I've seen in the last 8 years, is that losing percentage looked at whoever was in office and like, hell, I don't care. I'm not going to acknowledge this guy as president. And I think that happened for the first time.
I'm at 47%. I get Social Security, and this man publicly slurs me. 47% of the population is on some form of public assistance and dependent on government. Some of that 47% don't, despite his stated